King of the Harem Heaven, Chapter 9. On March 27, 1905, curious crowds gathered to watch as a long procession moved up Water Street and trudged on through Ben Harbor, on toward the grounds of the new Israelite colony. 85 men, women, and children, carrying all their worldly goods in cheap canvas duffel sacks, marched by. The House of David's Australian immigrants had arrived. King Ben's whirlwind tour of Australia had been a stormy one. Feelings against the Beardies had been strong in many towns, and the fear that this red-headed evangelist from the States would bring back the days of Roe and Jezreel had precipitated a number of violent riots. But once the citizens had realized that Ben Purnell was urging the Israelites to migrate to America, he'd received full cooperation from everyone. Mary had accompanied him. So had Cora Mooney and several of the choicest teenage daughters of Benton Harbor Israelites. After firmly instructing the converts he'd won to ship out steerage in order to save money, the king himself had returned first class with his attendants. It had been a pleasant, relaxing cruise after his strenuous preaching campaign, and he'd returned home to the pleasant news that the missionaries he'd sent out through England and Canada had done remarkably well. In less than 2 years, the population of Ben Purnell's kingdom had grown to nearly 500. Now, from the window of his royal quarters on the second floor of the fine new building he named Shiloh, the red-bearded monarch watched his converts arrive. He estimated their number and worth very quickly, singling out and appraising the young women among them and the girls who would soon be young women. Turning away from the window, he checked his appearance carefully before a large ornate mirror and sprinkled a few grains of birdseed on his shoulders. The shrewd and calculating look on his face dissolved and was replaced by a glow of divine piety. Then he started down to officially welcome the Australian newcomers. He moved down the long line of converts, shaking hands, greeting them one by one. "I'm Isabel Pritchard," a woman with 2 little girls scarcely more than babies told him. "I don't know if you remember me. You talked to my husband mostly. He's dead now, but we came anyway. This is Irene, and this is Hilda." Although his face hid it, Ben winced inside. He wanted able-bodied, productive men in his kingdom, not costly dependents. "That's most unfortunate," he nodded sympathetically. "If only he could have held on to life long enough to join the ingathering. In the true faith, death is, of course, unknown." One of the 2 little girls spoke up. "We don't have any papa anymore," she told him shyly. He knelt down and patted both their heads. "Don't you worry," he assured them. "I'll be your papa from now on." Their mother looked about her, a happy smile on her face. The grounds were green and well kept, shaded by great trees. Over near the arch that joins Shiloh with a new building being constructed beside it, a small band of long-haired bearded musicians were softly playing hymn music. "It's so peaceful here, a real refuge from the whole world." Ben Purnell nodded. "Would you like to turn in now?" he asked matter-of-factly. "That would be nice," the widow answered. "It was a rough trip with these 2 to handle." Ben shook his head, smiling patiently. "You don't understand. Would you like to turn in now? Lay not up for yourself treasures upon earth, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Mrs. Pritchard still didn't follow him. "If you will be perfect," he lectured her, a little more firmly now. "Go and sell that which you have and give to the poor, and you shall have treasure in heaven. Do little children hoard earthly wealth?" "Oh," the widow exclaimed, "you mean the money." Ben Purnell nodded. "If you're ready to turn in now, the young lady in the office there will help you." He pointed at the first floor of Shiloh. "There's only about 1,700 left," Mrs. Pritchard told him. "Time we paid for the funeral and got our passage." "The amount is unimportant," King Ben lied. "All that really matters is that you hold nothing back upon entering the kingdom." Again and again, all down the long line of immigrants, this little scene was repeated. Benjamin Franklin Purnell, throughout the last few years, had been formulating a few unusual personal theories about the best way to rule a religious cult. Now, without hesitating, he was testing his theories. Ben had never studied psychology or much of anything else, But he shrewdly guessed that all cultists and extreme fanatics had strong inner desire, even an actual need for suffering. He decided to operate on the principle that his Israelites were basically little different from the penitents, or the holy men of the Far East, who proved their faith by whipping themselves, sleeping on beds of spikes, or mutilating their bodies. If what the flying rollers really wanted was suffering, King Ben figured he was just the man to give it to them. Shiloh was completed now, and another large ornate building to be named Jerusalem was nearly finished beside it. And yet both were strictly reserved for Ben's own lavish apartment, for his business offices, for the smaller apartments of his chief pillars, and for the quarters of the young girls who were currently undergoing blood purification rites. For the little people of the sect, crude tiny log cottages were built in the woods across the road, containing only the simplest and cheapest of furnishings. "These things are deeply symbolic," he patiently explained to those who questioned this vast difference in standard of living. "Everything your messenger does, he does only to test you. You must remember to test your fitness to enter the kingdom." As Mike Mills had done before him, Ben Purnell granted his followers only the plainest articles of clothing once he'd relieved them of the burden of all their possessions. Also, like Mills, he demanded that they give up liquor, tobacco, and meat. And if an occasional Israelite girl who'd been sent to live at Shiloh set free whispers about the steak dinners, the cigarettes, or the beer and wine parties that were routine in the royal quarters, the king's explanation was always the same. He was merely testing their faith in him. Remembering how Prince Mike's attorney had almost saved him with the use of Bernice Bickle's confession, Ben Purnell demanded that all who entered the Seventh Kingdom write out full and detailed lifetime confessions. If one of these was found to contain nothing that might later be used against its author, King Ben would tear it up and demand another, angrily insisting that only by revealing all sins and confessing and repenting could anyone hope for eternal life. Many misguided souls actually invented crimes to satisfy the divine messenger. After a lifetime confession had finally been accepted, monthly confessions were required. Since there was little opportunity for sinning in the house of David, most of these were dull and worthless. But Ben had a number of trusted assistants known as sweepers who read all confessions, filed important bits of information for him, and burned the rest. Drunk with power now, Ben began switching the little people from one crude shack to another, at least once a week, to keep them from ever feeling the slightest trace of ownership. He went further and ordered all his subjects to abstain from normal marital relations, imposing what he called the virgin law. Even kissing was outlawed. He justified this from the Bible, Revelations 14:4. "These are they which were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These were redeemed from among men." But the simple truth was that King Ben was unsatisfied merely to have free choice of practically all women in his kingdom. He decided he wanted to have them exclusively. Benjamin Franklin Purnell discovered he'd guessed correctly. His cultists loved punishment. The more wretched they were as a result of his treatment, and the greater the contrast between the life he led and the life he prescribed for them, the more invincible his rule became. A few members of the Israelite colony, of course, objected to some of his most extreme measures. If all of Ben's eloquent alternating promises and threats failed to silence a rebellious flying roller's protests, a brief conference with the man would be held behind closed doors at Shiloh. Then, for the first time, the disillusionist cultist would see his king as he really was. Not a prophet, but a shrewd, ruthless conman. "Here's a $10 bill and a railroad ticket to Chicago," he'd announce, crisp and businesslike. "Goodbye, brother." "What about the money I turned in when I came here?" the apostate Israelite would demand. Ben would laugh. "You're a better man rid of it, brother. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. I want that money back." "See a lawyer then. You'll be told you had no right to demand a return of gifts made to this church or any other." "All right," the man might threaten. "I'm going straight to the nearest newspaper office and see what they think about all this. I'll let the whole world know what goes on here." King Ben would shake his head, open the man's file, and read aloud a few choice paragraphs from his confession. "In that case," he'd explain, "I'd also have to let the world know just what kind of man was making these charges, wouldn't I? No, brother, You do best to take that train to Chicago and just forget our little community even exists. In his dealings with the various businessmen of Benton Harbor, Ben Purnell also proved extremely down-to-earth for a profit. When the local price of lumber seemed too high, he leased a timber cutting site farther north on the lakeshore and sent a crew of bearded Israelites up to cut the wood he needed for colony buildings. Then he bought a lake schooner, the Rising Sun, and used it to bring the lumber back, both for the House of David buildings and to sell on the open market. In some ways, these first years at Benton Harbor, King Ben was still the medicine show pitchman he'd been in his covered wagon days. He sent a large, colorful House of David exhibition to the St. Louis World's Fair, complete with music and attractive young Israelite girls to preach the true faith and peddle copies of the Star of Bethlehem. He began making plans for an even more spectacular display at the coming Chicago World's Fair. But it was mainly in his regular preaching to his flock that his talent for show business came out. There are many men living today who heard Ben Purnell preach, a never-to-be-forgotten experience, for his sermons were as colorful as his red gold hair and beard. He would launch into terrifying descriptions of the torture that awaited the unfaithful, the 7 great plagues, the bottomless pit, the lake of burning brimstone. Roaring like a bull elk or sobbing like a lost bear cub in the night, he'd paint such detailed and graphic pictures of eternal damnation that few flying rollers could doubt their king's claim that he'd actually seen these things. Abruptly, his voice would grow calm and smooth and hypnotic, as he described just as eloquently the golden city with the jewel-studded foundations and the 12 gates of pearl, the reward for the faithful as soon as the millennium arrived. Finally, when his flock was as charged up emotionally as he could get them, he'd begin shouting questions at them, bringing them to their feet as they answered. Did they believe in him? Would they cast off all earthly values and accept his message? Did they trust him? Would they receive the true faith as he revealed it? Would they follow him into the Golden City? Strangely enough, the tabernacle where these services were held, directly across the street from Shiloh in Jerusalem, was a plain, inexpensive structure, very much like a public meeting hall. It was very much as though King Ben was so sure of his hold on his followers, so certain of their trust, that he was openly mocking them by providing the simplest, cheapest place of worship possible, and placing it close to his own luxurious quarters. The most crucial test of his power, through all those early years, came in the late months of 1906, when the Israelites were breathlessly waiting, day by day, for the millennium he promised. But King Ben met this problem head-on and proved equal to it. Calling a gigantic mass meeting of all his subjects, he spent 2 full hours lecturing and upbraiding them severely for their sinfulness, for their evil thoughts, for their lack of faith in him. And when he had them fully convinced of their unworthiness, he announced a startling new revelation. The Almighty was so angered by their lack of devotion to his prophet that he'd postpone the millennium, putting it off until some indefinite date in the future. It worked. There were a few flying rollers who felt they'd been tricked and began planning to leave. But the very great majority of the Israelites filed out of the tabernacle that day, searching their consciences for the slightest taint of doubt or disobedience, determining to prove their faith and devotion to their divine messenger in every way possible. Benjamin Franklin Purnell would give them plenty of chances to prove their faith, for from the very beginning, he'd been carrying on the old Rohite practices of blood cleansing or female circumcision. He'd established the inner mystic circle he'd been planning at Forstoria, keeping anywhere from 15 to 20 teenage girls quartered in a series of small rooms that adjoined his royal apartment, discarding the older ones when he tired of them, bringing in new ones as soon as they blossomed and caught his eye. There, behind the drawn shades of Shiloh, King Ben was gluttonizing himself on a scale that made Prince Mike's former godhead seem almost like monogamy.